So, as regular viewers to the channel will know, we have been trying to organise a climate discussion for quite a few months, because quite a number of members of the public have some serious concerns over the climate emergency that Colchester Council and many councils up and down the country have declared. Firstly, they are completely unable to define said climate emergency, so we're a little concerned as to if you don't know the parameters of it, how will you know when it's over? We have a 9-month email exchange going back and forth, and none of them had any clue what the climate emergency they declared was. But that aside, there are many other very vital questions, so we want to hear their side as to why they're so convinced. So we invited the Green Party and any party to put forward representatives to talk on behalf of declaring a climate emergency. But there was complete silence. So I contacted a very nice Green councillor that I'd come in contact with in the next county of Suffolk. Now, he's an old school Green and really into the true environmentalism, but also he enjoys speaking to people that have opposing views to him. So I thought he's going to be the perfect person because he won't shy away from presenting the facts. So let me read the email that I received from him. Dear Rachel, I have seen your video, and the problem you have is the condition on computer modelling. It's like asking a bricklayer to build a wall without any mortar. Glad you wish to have a sensible discussion. At present, I wouldn't go anywhere near it if I was your local party. So I thanked him and said, well, in that case, could there be the information that's behind the computer models, or someone explaining how they work? What we're looking for is more than just the predictions. There must be information behind it, so I will correct my poor wording of it in future videos. Can you guide me on what to say that would make you go near it? And then I got a rather astounding response to that. The real issue for me is this is becoming a trial of those that agreed a policy. If you wanted my take, if it were going to allow both views on this to come together, you could allow the balance of scientists to be representative of the scientific community as a whole. Therefore, if you fielded 2 scientists that believed that man-made CO2 emissions have little or no effect on climate, then you would need 16 to argue for. Anything less would give the wrong impression on those witnessing or viewing the debate. Given the country seems to be rioting at the drop of a hat on the basis of misinformation, quality information is a sometimes rare but precious commodity. I share some of your frustrations and wish you well. So I replied, you'd be most welcome to bring as many expert speakers as you like. However, we would have to divide the time for and against equally. The scientists we have lined up are actually part of the 97% consensus, as they both believe in climate change, they just don't think it's entirely man-made. In fact, less than 1% of climate scientists agree with the IPCC, as you can see in the research paper breakdown here. Though it's not the quantity of people, but the quality of the argument that counts. Science is not consensus. This is a simple presentation of facts, and then the audience can ask questions and make up their own mind. I thought you would jump at the chance to have experts put your views across in a constructive way. It's going to be critical moving forward that the population are on board with net zero, especially considering the financial implications of making it happen. You mentioned riots. How happy do you think the population is going to be when the cost of electricity goes up massively because of renewables and they can't afford to heat their homes or buy food? You can't force net zero onto people. You have to show them it's necessary, and now's your chance. If no one is willing to put forward speakers, it does rather prove that the climate emergency is pure propaganda. Any expert with any degree of professional pride wants to prove their point. In my industry, we get horticulturalists telling us that the only thing you need to make a good garden is plants. And as a garden designer, I have the alternative view that no, you do need good design as well as plants. So if I was called in to give a talk on why design is important to have a beautiful garden, I wouldn't need to bring 15 other garden designers with me to prove that point. I can do it on my own. Okay, I do concede that garden design is a slightly less complex topic than climate change. But the point I'm trying to make is any professional that believes in what they are saying is more than happy to talk to people about it. And that's just on garden design. You are telling us we are destroying the planet. Surely that's worth someone's time to come out and prove it. Wouldn't you love just to shut people like me up, present the facts that are irrefutable, and I will have to do a video saying, they're right, there is a climate emergency and net zero is urgent. The fact none of you are willing to supply an expert that can explain the figures behind this computer modelling, I'm afraid it does rather prove that this is nothing more than propaganda. So we're going to expand our invitation to Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, Just Stop Oil, whoever you like. But in the meantime, our local Green Party councillor, Mark Gocher, did respond on Twitter along similar lines. I personally do not debate, is there a climate emergency? Debating facts just creates a false impression about what is scientific consensus. However, what should we do to tackle the climate emergency would be a legitimate discussion. My response, we're not asking you to debate the facts, we're asking you to present them. What's behind the computer models? Why have scientists drawn those conclusions? If you're going to get people to go along with net zero, just telling us there's a climate emergency, the end, doesn't cut it. The point is 99% of scientific papers agree with man-made climate change. No, they don't, Mark. In that context, there is nothing to debate, and doing so just creates a false impression that there are two legitimate views. And then I go on to inform him that less than 1% of climate scientists agree with man-made climate change as set out by the IPCC. And then he's come back to me with something on Wikipedia, where they say the scientific consensus on climate change. There is a nearly unanimous scientific consensus that the Earth has been consistently warming since the start of the Industrial Revolution. Yes, that part the climate scientists do agree on. It's the next bit that they don't. And that the rate of recent warming is largely unprecedented, and that this warming is mainly the result of a rapid increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide caused by human activities. Right, that's what Wikipedia says. Shall we have a quick look at the article I sent him that actually looks at the climate papers, and I'll link to this in description below. So, out of nearly 12,000 extracts, 7,930 were arbitrarily excluded for expressing no opinion. So, 66% didn't say anything. The remaining 3,896 were marked as agreeing we cause some warming. Now, our climate experts also fall into this category. And most do, that we do cause some warming. 64 were marked as stating we caused most of the warming, that's half of 1%. 41 actually stated we caused most of the warming since 1850. So that's 0.3%. 0 were marked as endorsing a man-made catastrophe. So if you're going to go with the scientific consensus, the majority have no opinion. So the best we've got is just over 30% agreeing we caused some of the warming. So I'm afraid, gentlemen, the scientific consensus is a rather lame and mute argument. Then, because it was on Twitter, various other people chipped in. Without computer models, climate catastrophe wouldn't exist anywhere. Sea levels and polar ice have been stable for decades, polar bears and coral reefs are thriving, and 100% climate catastrophe predictions over the past 60 years have been 100% wrong. Then someone called Stuart jumped in to give his 4 pennies worth. Good to hear, Mark. The science is clear. No matter what all the YouTube performers claim, many of them have moved on from COVID denial, anti-vax, chemtrails and anti-5G onto the latest anti-science bandwagon. No need to give their nonsense any credibility. And then someone presented Dear Stuart with some actual science. I go by what the ModTran radiative models tell me. Don't be anti-science by denying ModTran. So as soon as Stuart is presented with some science, he says, muting as this is becoming a crankfest. Now the science that Stuart is refusing to look at because he considers it a crankfest is not disputed. The IPCC certainly don't dispute it, especially as the science is used in their own modelling. CO2's ability to force warming is inversely logarithmic, i.e. once it's reached its saturation point, you can quadruple it and it's not going to make a whole lot of difference. So, to paraphrase Dr. William Happer of Princeton University, imagine a coat of really thick, good red paint on a barn. Now, the first and second coats make all the difference, you really see it, but once it's reached its colour saturation, it doesn't matter how many coats you apply, it's not going to get a great deal redder. And CO2 acts in a similar way. And both Dr. William Happer and Dr. John Christie have independently worked out that it would be about a 1% increase in radiation if you double CO2. Interestingly, instead of giving us some climate papers to look at, Stuart chose to put his argument forth using a YouTuber. Now, I did watch the video that he sent, and yes, it was very well produced, it was very convincing, but it was clear that the person who made this probably hadn't seen the latest climate papers by CIRRUS on urban heat islands. Now, that only came out last year, and it does conclusively show that there is a difference between the IPCC adjusted models versus the rural on its own, and I go into that in more detail on the Lembit OPIC show, which I will link in the description below should you wish to watch that. Now, because I'm not a climate expert, I asked Paul Burgess if he had seen this video and what he thought, and he's left me a whole load of lovely explanation voice messages that basically show that there are a lot of flaws in his argument. So while on the surface this video might look like it's doing a good job of debunking Climate the Movie, according to Paul Burgess, it isn't, and I hope that one day he has the time to do a video on it, because it is worth going through it all. But anyway, he's a very busy man, so don't hold your breath on that one. Now, during our 9-month email correspondence with the council, all they kept coming up with was the IPCC report. Now, the full report is 186 pages. Now, the summary for policymakers is only 42 pages long. And interestingly enough, it's not the scientists that decide what goes into this report. No, it's politicians from each country.
The IPCC is a political organisation, not a scientific one. They go through each sentence and amend as they wish. Well, so what is the result of this? In this political summary, it is claimed that since the last report, weather extremes have strengthened. The heat waves, heavy downpours, droughts and hurricanes. So let's examine that last one, hurricanes. It is simply not true, because in the same IPCC 6 report in the scientific papers, the actual paper states there should be a 25% reduction in hurricane frequency and a 5% increase in intensity. This deception relies on the fact that governments do not read the 4,000 scientific papers, but just the summary for policymakers, a political document.
I'm afraid the public trust in politicians is rather non-existent. So yes, we do want to see actual proof, not just the pretty charts created from tenuous computer modelling. Because the computer models have not been at all accurate over the past few decades. So my question to you all is, why do you believe their future projections are correct when they haven't managed to get their projections correct in the last few decades? So the IPCC report isn't enough, and there are so many questions that need to be answered. So perhaps, Stuart, instead of the name calling, you could answer me the following questions, and Mark too. So there is a correlation between CO2 and temperature increase. But if CO2 is the driver of temperature increase, how come it goes up approximately 400 to 800 years after the temperature increase? Could you explain that? Because many of us are struggling on that one. Could you explain why man-made CO2 is being blamed for temperature increase when the science clearly shows with MODTRAN, whilst increased CO2 levels can and do cause some warming, can you explain how something that can't possibly generate that amount of heat is being blamed for generating that amount of heat? Human activity produces a minuscule amount of CO2 compared to what happens in nature. So how is stopping the amount of CO2 that human activity produces going to change the planet when CO2 doesn't cause that much of a warming in the first place? And why isn't there more focus on the predominant greenhouse gas, water vapour, and the effects of clouds upon our temperature, which is far more than CO2? And how do you expect the public to take you seriously with your climate alarmism when you won't use full chart data? Here's a case in point. From 1960 to now, you can see the temperature's gone up dramatically. But what happens if you take it back before 1960? Oh look, the chart's going in the other direction. That's hardly convincing, now is it? Or accurate data for that matter. Now, whilst it is true that sometimes temperatures do need to be adjusted for certain things, your adjustments shouldn't make this much difference where it goes one way with one thing and the complete opposite with the raw data. And why is it, as soon as there's the slightest warm spell or freak weather condition, that it is labelled climate change, when the mere definition of climate has to be a minimum average over 30 years, and most climate cycles happen over hundreds and thousands of years? So we do have a lot of very genuine questions that we need answers to. Just saying, there's a climate emergency because we said so, end of, that's not selling it to people, it really isn't. Now, if members of the public, like Stuart, want to ignore the science, that's fine, they're completely at liberty to do so. But you, as councillors, you are here to put the public interest first, and if you are not looking at all the information, then you are not doing that. Do you even know why you believe there's a climate emergency? Which climate papers have you read? Or, like most people, have you just heard it on the mainstream media? Was it from those delightful people at the BBC? Yes, Antarctica's melting, we're all going to die. Well, actually, the eastern side is gaining ice. It's only the western side where it's melting. And it's melting from underneath the ice sheet. Is that really down to the car drivers of Colchester and the flatulent farm animals in our surrounding countryside? Or could it possibly be to do with the fact the western side of Antarctica has probably the world's largest number of active volcanoes under it? They seem to forget to mention that at the BBC. If only their reporters spent as much time concentrating on the climate as they do with children and animals. So, last chance. Provide somebody to talk us through the IPCC data and prove that there is a genuine climate emergency. Failure to do so just proves this is nothing more than pure propaganda.